Next speaker is Ed Lincoln. Ed?
I'm going to change the subject a little bit from the micro level to the macro level. I'm an economist. I apologize for that. But I thought it would be helpful at this meeting for someone to provide a little bit of economic context for what has been happening to Japan the last couple of months and what it possibly means. So, the earthquake, tsunami, nuclear disaster has been quite a blow for Japan. It's actually been worse than most of us anticipated in the first day or two after it struck. But the good news is that Japan is already moving out of the disaster period into recovery and reconstruction, and that's going to continue for the next couple of years. Japan hasn't gone away. It's going to be just as important to the United States as it was before. This audience probably doesn't need to be told that. But quite frankly, if you were to watch the American media, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, all of the American stations, you'd almost have gotten the impression that Japan was falling apart and was going to disappear because of this earthquake, and that is absolutely not true. All right, so as an economist, when I look at Japan, I see two things happening in the wake of this disaster. One is on the supply side, and one is on the demand side. On the supply side, one thing that I always like to point out to audiences that may include some people who are not economists is that the actual destruction in the earthquake and tsunami doesn't make a bit of difference. We don't measure that destruction. Right? So if your house were to burn down tomorrow here in Los Angeles, that is not subtracted out of American GDP, the value of your house. Right? All we measure with GDP is the value of current output. So what you lose in an earthquake and tsunami is not the value of those things that got destroyed, but the loss of output that they might have produced. So if your factory falls down, what we count is the loss of the output from that factory. So in this case, yes, there was some destruction. Thank goodness, actually, not a lot. As you heard from Consul General Ihara, those three prefectures that were most heavily affected only produced 4% of total GDP in Japan. And quite frankly, not everything fell down. In fact, in the city of Sendai, no major buildings collapsed. The real destruction of property was in those fishing villages on the coast. So we lost fish processing plants, fishing vessels. Yes, that output is gone. The rest of it is damage to factories. And so now we're waiting to repair that damage and get those factories back online. The second supply cut thing, though, I think there was a surprise to many people, including me, which a number of people have mentioned, is the supply chain effect. I thought initially, well, 4% of GDP up in this area, a lot of it is going to be agriculture and fishing, probably not a lot of manufacturing. But lo and behold, there are some factories up in that part of Japan. As you've heard, a factory that produces black paint for automobiles, out of production for a while. So for someone like me, I don't dig into this stuff in enough detail to know who's got a factory up there that just happens to provide 70% of global output of some obscure little component. But indeed, there seem to be some examples of that kind of thing. This, of course, affects other Japanese companies more than it affects, say, American companies in the U.S., but in fact, it has affected American firms and European firms and Chinese firms as well, because of these instances where there's some critical component that just happens to come from a factory that suffered some damage. The third issue, the supply part, that was also a surprise to me, was electric power shortages in Tokyo. Right, so the Tohoku area where the earthquake occurred doesn't produce a whole lot of Japan's GDP. The Tokyo area does. No buildings fell down. There was some damage to some factories in the Tokyo area. But the big issue there was a lack of electricity. The 4 nuclear plants that got knocked out and are still a problem don't produce enough of Japan's electricity to have made that much of a difference in Tokyo. What got added on to, however, was the stoppage of a number of non-nuclear power plants by TEPCO, most of which were actually somewhat farther away from the worst area of destruction, and that was something of a surprise. So that's the supply side. Stuff gets destroyed, there's less electricity, can't produce as much output. There was, however, a fascinating add-on to this in Japan on the demand side. And that is this mood of enryo or jishiku that seems to have taken over at least parts of Japan. Roughly, people in Tohoku are suffering. I shouldn't go out and have a good time. I find it shocking, for example, that Ueno Park in Tokyo canceled Hanami. Right? Lots of people in Tokyo go and sit and drink and eat under the cherry blossoms in the spring in Ueno Park. Did not happen this year. Schools canceled graduation ceremonies. Companies canceled the big ceremonies for their incoming new employees. This is something that economists call the paradox of thrift, if you can remember all the way back to your Econ 101 course in college, which is basically that if you believe that the world is going to be worse tomorrow and therefore you better save more money and spend less so that you'll be in better shape to get through this bad future, you're going to make that future happen. Because by not spending, you've just caused the economy to go down. This is what has happened to Japan. We have a bad situation, supply cuts in Japan. Well, consumers in Japan then went and made it worse by not going out and having a good time. I actually wrote an op-ed about this for a Japanese magazine a few weeks ago, and I ended it by saying, if the Prime Minister had wanted to show real leadership, he should have spent Golden Week going to a Japanese inn, ryokan, up in the Tohoku area, invite all the local politicians in and have a big party, spend lots of money. That's what Tohoku needed, is to have the tourists come back and spend money, but they didn't. All right, well, I'm an economist, so I'm going to fill in then from this introduction with a couple of slides, briefly go through a few numbers. So this is the latest GDP data for Japan. That first column there in bold is total GDP. Well, Japan was already going through a little bit of a downward blip at the end of last year. The October-December quarter economy shrank at a 3% rate. That was widely believed to have been caused by the ending of tax benefits for basic cash for comfort for automobiles, and also an increase in the tax on cigarettes, which, believe it or not, actually was caused so many people to rush out and buy their next year's supply of cigarettes in September before the higher taxes kicked in, that it had actually a measurable impact on GDP. All right, so that should have been temporary. The economy should have bounced back in the first quarter. I was actually rather shocked, as were most economists, that the number has come in at minus 3.7%. And again, for non-economists out there, this does not mean the economy shrank 3.7% in the first quarter of this year. Right, we measure the change in GDP quarter to quarter, so that first quarter number represents the change from the fourth quarter, but it is annualized. Right, so the actual drop in GDP was less than 1%. But you have to basically multiply that by 4. And so what all of these numbers are, you keep this in mind, we do the same thing in the United States. When you see those GDP figures every quarter, they represent how much would the economy grow or shrink if we continued to behave for an entire year as we did in that quarter. All right, so this number actually looks a little bit worse than it really is. But it's still shocking that something that happened only 3 weeks before the end of the quarter was so big, had such a big impact on the economy that for the quarter as a whole, we had a decline of a little bit less than 1% or 3.7% on an annualized basis. And part of this behavior of consumers, that next column is household consumption, and you see that was down 2.2% at an annualized rate for the quarter. Okay, let me flip through the rest of this relatively quickly. The big impact has been on manufacturing output because of these factories that have been damaged. The broad red line is total manufacturing output. The shaded part over there at the edge is where we get the impact of the economy. We have data for March and then April. And if we go to the next slide, so all manufacturing output in Japan went down 16% in March and already began to bounce back a little bit in April by 1%. That's actually the beginning of recovery that will strengthen over the course of the summer. Very unevenly distributed. When you read the newspapers about all these bad things happening in Japan, what do they talk about? Automobiles. Well, guess what? Automobile production, passenger cars, down 54%. This is not annualized. This is simply the drop in production from February to March. But iron and steel, down 10%. Chemicals, only down 2%. Precision instruments, down 13%, but they actually rebound strongly in April. So the impact of this earthquake has been concentrated only on a couple of industries, one of them being automobiles. The other one is electronics. So, and that too is all over the place. Semiconductor and flat panel display manufacturing equipment down 26%, but back up in April. Household electronic machinery. I assume that includes things like, microwave ovens, but also PCs, down 29%, and another 29% in April. But PCs, not very much, down 5% and up 3%. So it's all over the place, and depends very much on where was production located in Japan for these various different products. Now, back briefly to the behavior of people. Manufacturing we can understand. Not a whole lot of damage to the service sector, and yet that too, you can see, is down. We only have the March data. We don't have April in here, but you can see coming into March a drop in a number of things. And again, you see it's all over the place. So for services as a whole, down 6%. Restaurants, eating and drinking places down there, down 12%. Right? People were not going out and getting drunk. And then a couple of puzzles here, way down the bottom, my bottom line down here, fitness clubs, a 13% drop in the sales of fitness clubs. I don't get it. Maybe this is actually the electric problem in Tokyo, that they didn't have the electricity to run the equipment in the fitness center, but it does seem a little puzzling that people would say, oh, folks are suffering in Tohoku, I shouldn't go to my fitness club. But who knows? But here the biggies are transportation. Right? So a 14% drop in international air transportation and a 23% drop in domestic air travel. Again, don't have those data for April, but certainly we have a little bit of anecdotal information for Golden Week. JR Express train traffic down 11% from a year earlier, Golden Week, and Japan Airlines traffic, international plus domestic, down a whopping 25% during Golden Week compared to a year earlier. All right, so